Hi, I'm Dr. Ava Carter, and if you've ever lost weight on the scale, but your belt size barely moved, this video is for you.
Because there are two completely different types of fat on your body, and most people are fighting the wrong one. There's subcutaneous fat, which is the fat you can pinch under your skin, and then there's visceral fat, which is the fat that wraps around your organs deep inside your abdomen. It sits around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, and even around your heart. And this is the fat that's actually dangerous. Visceral fat isn't just sitting there doing nothing, it's metabolically active. It pumps out inflammatory chemicals around the clock, and that constant low-grade inflammation is what drives insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, high blood pressure, heart disease, and even certain cancers. So visceral fat isn't a cosmetic problem, it's a survival problem. But here's the good news, and this is the part almost nobody tells you. Visceral fat is actually the easiest fat on your body to lose because it's more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat, which means it responds faster to the right interventions. And here's something else worth understanding before we go further. Not all fat is created equal, and your body doesn't store it randomly. Genetics play a role in where you tend to accumulate fat first, but visceral fat specifically tends to build up when there's a combination of chronic calorie surplus, high stress, poor sleep, and low activity levels happening at the same time. That combination is incredibly common in modern life, which is exactly why visceral fat has become such a widespread problem, even in people who don't look overweight from the outside. You can be what doctors sometimes call skinny fat, meaning a completely normal body weight on the outside, while still carrying a dangerous amount of visceral fat on the inside. So this isn't just a video for people trying to lose a lot of weight. This applies to almost everyone. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the fastest, most research-backed way to target visceral fat specifically. We'll cover the foods that shrink it, the drinks that accelerate it, whether meal timing actually matters, the exact type of exercise that outperforms everything else, and one lifestyle factor that almost nobody talks about that might be silently keeping your visceral fat exactly where it is. Let's get into it. Let's start with food, because what's on your plate every single day either feeds visceral fat or starves it. And the single most underrated tool for targeting visceral fat is soluble fiber. Now, soluble fiber is the type of fiber that dissolves in water and forms a gel-like substance in your gut. You find it in foods like oats, beans, lentils, apples, pears, Brussels sprouts, and flaxseed. And there's a landmark study out of Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center that followed over 1,000 adults for 5 years, using CT scans to actually measure their visceral fat directly, not just their weight on a scale. And what they found was striking. For every additional 10 grams of soluble fiber a person ate per day, their visceral fat accumulation slowed down by close to 4% over that 5-year period. And 10 grams of soluble fiber isn't some extreme number. That's about 2 small apples, a cup of green peas, and half a cup of beans. That's it. Now here's why soluble fiber works so well on visceral fat specifically. First, it slows down digestion, which blunts the insulin spikes that come from eating carbohydrates. And chronically high insulin is one of the biggest drivers of visceral fat storage because insulin is a storage hormone. It tells your body to hold on to fat instead of burning it. Second, soluble fiber feeds the good bacteria in your gut, and those bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids when they ferment fiber, which actually help regulate how your body stores and burns fat. And third, soluble fiber keeps you full for longer, so you naturally end up eating less without feeling like you're restricting yourself. So if you want one simple change that has actual data behind it, add a source of soluble fiber to every single meal. Oats in the morning, a side of lentils or beans at lunch, and vegetables like broccoli or Brussels sprouts at dinner. Now, after fiber, the next thing you need to dial in is your protein intake, and this one surprises people because we usually think of protein as a muscle-building nutrient, not a fat loss nutrient. But there's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial published just a few years ago that looked specifically at this. Researchers put over 100 overweight adults with metabolic syndrome on a mild calorie deficit and split them into 2 groups. One group got a high-protein supplement, and the other got a normal protein comparator with the same number of calories. After 12 weeks, both groups lost some visceral fat because they were both in a calorie deficit. But the high-protein group lost significantly more visceral fat than the normal protein group, even though the calories were identical. And when the researchers dug deeper, they found that protein was actually changing the gut microbiome in a way that activated amino acid metabolism, which seemed to be part of the mechanism driving that extra visceral fat loss. Beyond that gut effect, protein also has what's called a higher thermic effect of food, meaning your body burns more calories just digesting it compared to carbs or fat. And protein preserves your muscle mass while you're losing weight, which matters because muscle is what keeps your metabolism running high. So a good target to aim for is somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of your body weight per day, spread across your meals. Think eggs and Greek yogurt in the morning, chicken, fish, or tofu at lunch and dinner, and if you're struggling to hit that number, a simple whey or plant-based protein shake can close the gap. And one more thing on food before we move to drinks. You need to get serious about cutting back on ultra-processed foods and added sugar, especially anything with high fructose corn syrup. And I know that sounds obvious, but here's the specific reason it matters for visceral fat. When you eat a lot of fructose, your liver is essentially the only organ that can process it, and when it gets overloaded, your liver starts converting that fructose directly into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. And a lot of that new fat gets stored right where your liver sits, which is deep in your visceral cavity. So sugary drinks, pastries, and processed snacks aren't just empty calories, they're actively manufacturing visceral fat inside your body. You don't need to go to zero, but swapping soda for sparkling water and swapping packaged snacks for something like nuts or fruit is one of the highest leverage changes you can make. Now, before we move on from food, I want to address something you've probably heard 100 times, which is intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, and I want to give you an honest answer here instead of hype. There have been a number of randomized trials looking at whether simply shrinking your eating window, say to 8 hours a day, does anything special for visceral fat beyond what a normal calorie deficit would do, and the results are genuinely mixed. Some smaller studies show a modest edge for time-restricted eating, but some of the larger, more rigorous trials, including a major multi-arm study that used MRI to directly measure visceral fat, found that people following an 8-hour eating window lost weight and improved their metabolic markers, but their visceral fat reduction was no better than a control group simply eating a Mediterranean-style diet on a normal schedule. Interestingly, a different type of fasting, alternate day fasting, where you cycle between a very low-calorie day and a normal eating day, has shown a more consistent direct effect on visceral fat specifically, likely because it drives a larger overall reduction in weekly calorie intake. So here's the honest takeaway. If a specific eating window fits your lifestyle and helps you naturally eat less without obsessing over it, use it as a tool. But don't believe the idea that there's something magical about the clock. What matters far more for visceral fat is the total calorie balance, the quality of what you're eating, and the consistency of the other factors we're about to cover. Don't let meal timing distract you from the levers that actually move the needle. Now let's talk about drinks, because just like the last video I referenced, the research on this is genuinely strong. Green tea remains one of the most well-studied beverages for visceral fat, thanks to a class of compounds called catechins, and specifically one called EGCG. These are polyphenols that act as antioxidants, but they also directly interfere with how your body stores fat. Catechins boost fat oxidation, meaning your body pulls more stored fat out to be used as fuel. They also inhibit an enzyme called pancreatic lipase, which is what your body uses to break down and absorb dietary fat, so some of the fat you eat simply passes through instead of being stored. And when you combine catechins with the natural caffeine in tea, you get a synergistic effect, where fat burning is boosted even more than either compound alone. Multiple clinical trials using catechin-enriched green tea, in the range of 500 to 600 milligrams of catechins per day, have shown measurable reductions in visceral fat over 8 to 12 weeks. If you want to maximize your catechin intake, go for matcha or sencha, since they're less processed and retain more of these compounds than heavily oxidized teas like black tea. Coffee is worth mentioning too. Black coffee, without the sugar and cream, contains chlorogenic acids and caffeine, both of which modestly increase your resting metabolic rate and support fat oxidation. It's not as dramatic as green tea's effect on visceral fat specifically, but as a zero-calorie beverage that slightly nudges your metabolism upward and helps control appetite, it earns its place in a visceral fat-focused routine. Just be mindful of what you're adding to it, because a coffee loaded with syrup and whipped cream can undo any metabolic benefit and then some. Now let's move to what actually makes the biggest difference, and that's exercise. Because you can dial in your diet perfectly, but if you're not moving your body the right way, you're leaving most of the visceral fat reduction on the table. There's a large systematic review and meta-analysis that pooled data from over 80 randomized controlled trials, and it found that vigorous intensity aerobic exercise and high-intensity interval training, or HIIT, were the two most effective exercise types for reducing visceral fat specifically. Resistance training was still beneficial for your overall health, your strength, and your metabolism, but it wasn't as directly effective at shrinking visceral fat compared to these higher-intensity cardio approaches. Now, when researchers compared HIIT directly against steady, vigorous aerobic exercise, the two came out roughly equal in most studies. There wasn't a statistically significant difference between them for adults. So this isn't about finding some secret perfect protocol. It's about consistently doing something that gets your heart rate up. And I want to underline why intensity seems to matter more than duration when it comes to visceral fat specifically, even though that feels counterintuitive. Vigorous exercise triggers a much larger release of catecholamines, which are hormones like adrenaline and noradrenaline that specifically stimulate the breakdown of fat stored deep in the abdomen. Visceral fat cells actually have a higher density of the receptors that respond to these hormones compared to fat cells just under your skin, which is part of why visceral fat tends to melt away faster once you start training at a real intensity. Low-intensity movement, like a leisurely stroll, is still valuable for your overall health and your daily calorie burn, but it doesn't trigger nearly the same hormonal cascade, so it shouldn't be your only form of exercise if visceral fat is the specific target. There's also a fascinating older study that illustrates just how powerful even a small amount of the right exercise can be. Researchers had participants do just 2 45-minute cycling sessions per week at an intensity of about 75% of their peak oxygen capacity for 2 months. And in that short window, visceral fat dropped by close to half. Insulin sensitivity improved by more than 40%, and notably their total body weight barely changed on the scale. This is such an important point, so let me say it clearly. The number on your bathroom scale is a poor measure of what's actually happening to your visceral fat. You can be doing everything right, losing dangerous internal fat and gaining metabolic health, and still see almost no movement on the scale, because you might be losing fat while your body composition shifts and even holds steady in total weight. So don't let the scale discourage you if you're following a consistent plan. As for intensity, here's a simple way to gauge it without a heart rate monitor. If you're doing moderate intensity exercise, you should be able to hold a conversation in full sentences, but you'll sound a little out of breath. If you're doing vigorous intensity exercise, you should only be able to get out a few words before you need to pause and catch your breath. Aim to land your cardio sessions somewhere between 70 and 85% of your estimated maximum heart rate. And based on the available research, the sweet spot for visceral fat reduction seems to be around 2 to 3 sessions per week, each lasting 30 to 45 minutes. Now, I want to be clear that resistance training still matters enormously, even though it's not the top performer for visceral fat specifically. Building and maintaining muscle mass keeps your resting metabolic rate elevated, protects you from age-related muscle loss, and improves how your body handles blood sugar, which indirectly supports visceral fat loss too. So the ideal approach isn't cardio instead of strength training, it's cardio as your primary visceral fat targeting tool, with 2 to 3 strength sessions layered in each week for everything else your body needs. If you're just starting out, here's a realistic way to structure your week. 2 sessions of vigorous cardio or HIIT, 2 to 3 sessions of full body resistance training, and then movement in between, like walking, on the other days. You don't need to start at 75% of your peak capacity on day 1. Begin at a pace that's genuinely challenging for you personally, and progressively increase the intensity or duration every couple of weeks as your fitness improves. What matters most in the first month isn't hitting some perfect number, it's building the habit so consistently that missing a session feels unusual instead of expected. And here's something the research is very clear about. The effect of exercise on visceral fat is dose-dependent. That means the more consistent, higher intensity activity you do, generally the more visceral fat you lose, up to a point. Research published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that people who exercised more frequently or at higher intensities saw proportionally greater reductions in visceral fat. But here's the interesting contrast. That same dose-response relationship doesn't hold nearly as strongly for calorie restriction. In other words, there's a point where cutting your calories further just doesn't give you extra visceral fat loss and can actually backfire by slowing your metabolism and increasing stress hormones. So you don't need to starve yourself. You need to move your body consistently, hard enough to feel it, and let that do the heavy lifting. Now, before we wrap up, I want to cover one factor that almost never gets mentioned in videos about visceral fat, and that's sleep. This might genuinely be the most underrated lever you have, because poor sleep can quietly sabotage every other effort you're making. There's a randomized controlled crossover study out of the Mayo Clinic that put this to the test directly. Participants were restricted to insufficient sleep for a period, with free access to food, and compared to a control period of adequate sleep, and the results were striking. Just a period of insufficient sleep led to a 9% increase in total abdominal fat, and specifically an 11% increase in visceral fat, compared to when the same people got proper sleep, 11%, from sleep alone. Here's the mechanism behind it. When you're sleep deprived, your body treats it as a stressor, and it responds by raising cortisol, your primary stress hormone, and visceral fat tissue has a much higher density of cortisol receptors than the fat just under your skin. So your body is almost literally wired to route stress-driven fat storage straight to your abdomen. On top of that, poor sleep disrupts the hormones that regulate hunger, lowering leptin, which tells your brain you're full, and raising ghrelin, which makes you hungrier, especially for sugary, high-calorie foods. So a few nights of bad sleep can leave you eating more, craving worse foods, and storing a disproportionate share of it as visceral fat, even if your calorie intake barely changes. The fix here isn't complicated, even if it's hard to execute consistently. Aim for 7 to 9 hours a night, keep a consistent bedtime and wake time, and reduce bright light and screen exposure in the hour before bed. If you're doing everything right with food and exercise but ignoring your sleep, you're essentially fighting this battle with one hand tied behind your back. And sleep isn't the only stress-related factor worth mentioning. Chronic psychological stress, the kind that comes from an overloaded work schedule or ongoing anxiety, activates that same cortisol pathway even when your sleep is fine. You don't need to eliminate stress from your life, that's not realistic for anyone. But building in small, consistent stress-lowering habits, like a short daily walk outside, a few minutes of slow breathing, or simply protecting some downtime in your evenings, can measurably lower your baseline cortisol over time. And a lower baseline cortisol means less of that signal telling your body to route extra fat straight to your visceral stores. Think of stress management not as a bonus wellness activity, but as a direct physiological lever on your abdominal fat, right alongside diet and exercise. Last thing I want to touch on is alcohol, because it deserves a quick mention. Beyond the empty calories, alcohol is processed by your liver in a way that takes priority over fat burning. While your liver is busy metabolizing alcohol, it pauses fat oxidation almost entirely, and any excess calories from that drink are far more likely to be shuttled toward visceral storage around your abdominal organs, especially your liver itself. This doesn't mean you need to eliminate alcohol completely, but if visceral fat is your priority right now, cutting back to occasional moderate drinking will meaningfully speed up your results. So let's bring this all together. If you want to shrink visceral fat as fast as the science allows, here's your actual game plan. On the food side, get roughly 10 grams of soluble fiber into your day through oats, beans, lentils, and fruit. Aim for 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and cut back on ultra-processed foods and added sugar, especially anything loaded with high-fructose corn syrup. Don't stress over the exact hours you eat in, the total quality and quantity of your food matters far more than the clock. On the drink side, swap in green tea, ideally matcha or sencha, and use black coffee instead of sugary drinks. On the exercise side, prioritize vigorous aerobic exercise or HIIT 2 to 3 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes. Layer in resistance training for the rest of your health, and remember that the effort is dose-dependent, so consistency and intensity beat perfection. And don't ignore sleep or stress. 7 to 9 hours a night isn't a luxury, it's one of the most powerful visceral fat tools you have, and it's completely free, and neither is a short walk or a few slow breaths when things feel overwhelming. If I had to rank these by how fast they move the needle, based on everything the research shows, I'd put vigorous exercise and sleep at the very top, because they act on the hormonal pathways driving visceral fat storage most directly. Right behind that, I'd put your fiber and protein intake because they change the internal environment your fat cells are operating in every single day. And then everything else, the green tea, the coffee, the meal timing, the stress habits, those are the accelerants that make the whole system work faster and more smoothly, but they were never meant to replace the fundamentals. None of this requires extreme restriction or some complicated supplement stack. It requires showing up consistently, targeting the right levers, and giving your body a few months to respond, because unlike stubborn subcutaneous fat, visceral fat genuinely does respond fast once you start doing the right things. Pick 2 or 3 changes from this video, start with those this week, and layer in the rest once they become automatic. I'm Dr. Ava Carter. Thank you for watching, stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.